As part of splitting our focus and dividing up into the segments we needed in order to achieve our goal, Eliza took the materials that we acquired from Alan Wallendor and a book that he also had acquired about the crafting of magical items using magical ingredients, and started to begin running her own tests and experiments. I ended up having to clear out an entire room for her to perform her work in, to which she brought an extraordinarily large amount of equipment, machining tools, chemistry sets, and a myriad of other things that I simply didn't even recognize. After setting up her experiment room, me and Alice took to the second part of the arrangement, which was, of course, magical training. Eliza would fall behind having to work on experiments rather than training, at least in terms of magical ability. However, we couldn't afford it. We needed Eliza to start running those experiments. Even if there would be a power gap that would start to emerge, we couldn't afford to wait for her. So, me and Alice escorted ourselves to the forest clearing that we had taken to using for our training. As we finally reached our destination, Alice turned to me with her usual cheerful expression. "Okay, Reginald, your defensive skills have definitely picked up, and you're far more capable of defending yourself now than you were when it started. I still think you could use some work, but without Eliza here to throw surprise attacks, I think the training would be a little lackluster, and not quite as effective. So instead, we're going to work on a different aspect of training. I think you'll like this one, primarily because it doesn't involve you getting beat up. So I'll lay it out for you. Basically, what we're going to work on is your magical output." I looked at her a little bit puzzled. "I'm not really sure what you mean, Alice. Could you clarify that a bit?" I asked. "Oh, no problem. It's really pretty simple. Your magical output is the level of magic that you can disperse at one time, and the speed at which you gather that magic. Basically, Reginald, this training is to increase your overall speed when it comes to casting. It's all well and good to be able to use small spells that don't require that much magical energy, or spells that rely on a continuous flow of energy. But you're still lacking in one key area, and that would be extraordinarily powerful spells. Spells that simply take too much energy for you to be able to cast them in any sort of quick manner. Basically, it takes you too long. In a battle between magic casters, a key factor that can play a role in who wins and who loses is the speed at which they can cast spells, especially spells of high power levels. And right now, Reginald, you're about as low on the totem pole in that category as can be. I mean, really, you should have seen how long it took you to cast that big shield when you were fighting Sylvester. He might as well have been waiting for paint to dry. And that was simply putting a lot of energy into a low-level spell. With high-level spells, if you try to cast them before the energy is collected, it won't even work. Thus, you have to increase the speed at which you gather the magical energy that's needed for the attack. And if it comes down to a contest of speed between you and your opponent, in clutch moments, this will be the deciding factor," Alice said, cheerfully explaining the whole thing to me. Alice's experience when it came to practical use of magic was still better than mine. While the magical index did include information about how to cast magic, incantations, use, spells themselves, it didn't include practical aspects of battle or how to increase power levels when it came to the amount of magic you were using. I often find myself questioning how good of a deal I actually got from the man in the pinstripe suit. I wish I had been more thorough when I put together what the index contained. There was just so much information that was part of the magical world, but simply wasn't included in the index. Basically because it's not part of simply being able to cast a spell or know how to cast it, but rather other things that pertain to realistic situations in which you have to use the magic. In the same way that the magical index also doesn't include the processes for making magical items. I simply don't have access to the information. It's lucky for me that Alice is here to fill in the gaps, I thought to myself, as Alice tried to explain more to me. Now listen closely, Reginald. This next training exercise is pretty simple. All you're gonna have to do is gather magical energy. It's pretty basic. Just focus your mind on gathering as much magical energy as fast as you possibly can, and then raise that amount to the maximum that you can possibly hold without releasing it. And then simply don't. Let the magical energy reabsorb back into your system once you've reached your critical max. And after the magic reabsorbs, you simply repeat the process. The objective is to get your body used to maxing out that amount of power in as short a time frame as you possibly can. As for current stretch goals, I think we're gonna set a bar for about half. In other words, I want you to charge your magical power to maximum for use of a spell, and I'm gonna time how long it takes you. And once you reach your maximum and let the energy reabsorb, we'll effectively have a time frame for how long it takes you to do it. And then all there is to do is to just repeat the process until your body gets used to doing it. Effectively, I want to cut your time in half at a minimum. Honestly, I still think that's below par, but it can be our first stretch goal. So go ahead, Reginald. Charge that energy, Alice said, giving me a cheerful thumbs up as we began the training. But despite Alice's claims that this would be easier than the regular training, it really wasn't. Trying to focus my magical energy like that and intensify it to the max was simply exhausting. Even just doing it once had me winded. But I'd just have to keep doing it over and over again. The amount of strain that raising that magical energy put on my body was far more intense than I expected it to be. But Alice was right. If I was going to be in conflict with other casters, I'd need to increase my overall ability. Being able to cast more powerful spells more quickly is definitely an asset that I need to acquire. So, for several weeks, our training continued like that. Alice joined me in order to help increase her power level when it came to how rapidly she could gather energy. Quite frankly, she put me to shame. She would already be done and repeating the process before I even got a quarter of the way through. It's clear that Alice must do an insane amount of training in order to be this good. Honestly, I don't know where she finds the time for it, especially when she's fitting training me into the mix too. Regardless, the training seemed to be going smoothly for about 2 weeks, until, of course, another problem arose. It was about the middle of the day through our training when me and Alice got a long-distance magical communication from Eliza. We heard her voice inside of our heads. "You guys, you have to get back here right now. This is super important. ASAP. ASAP. No dilly-dallying." Eliza's voice echoed inside of our heads. Me and Alice gave each other a curious expression, but obliged the request anyways. As we made our way back into the estate and found our way to Eliza's experimentation room, we walked in to find that everything was not as we left it. Since we were last in here, Eliza seems to have been doing rearranging, and a lot of it at that. Equipment had been moved into different places and set up in different ways. It looked as if some sections were taken apart and put back together, almost as if she mixed them with other sections reassembling them to create something new. The entire room had a strange smell to it that definitely didn't sit right with the nose. Eliza herself was simply standing in the middle of the room beside a pile of the ingredients and materials that we had gotten from Alan Wallendor. Standing there tapping her foot, hands on her hips, and her clothes stained with soot, debris, and a myriad of other things. She stood staring at us with a very upset expression. "It's all garbage, Reginald," Eliza said, pointing down to the pile of materials. "More than 3/4 of his inventory is garbage. Basically useless. And not only that, I've managed to work my way through the other materials, the ones that were actually useful. So effectively, I have nothing left." "What?" I replied, shocked. "What do you mean it's garbage? You mean it's not magical?" I asked, starting to grow very concerned of the direction this conversation was going in. "Oh, it has some minor amount of magical energy to it. Some things might have minor use, but it's all simply too weak. All of the magical goods in this pile are basically equivalent to inferior product, like the equivalent of trying to start a fire with coal, but finding out that 3/4 of the coal is actually just lumps of dirt. And because of that, you can't start a fire with it. It's useless." Alan Wallendor kept a detailed journal of his transactions and where he bought all his magical goods from. After I started coming across these defective goods, I started trying to look into the diary to see if there were any correlations between purchases and the qualities of the goods obtained, and found a very clear line drawn in the sand. Basically, all of the goods he bought from a specific vendor were absolutely high quality, at least in comparison to this stuff. There's no question that the materials gained from this vendor are exactly what he ordered, while the rest of this stuff basically amounts to being sold on a shiesty deal. Basically, he got swindled. And the really sad part about it is that he actually thinks he was getting a better deal. Talking about how much of a better business transaction it was dealing with this vendor, the speed of the turnaround, how pleasant he was to deal with. Well, of course he was. He was swindling him. Meanwhile, all he has written about the original vendor is complaints. Complaints about the speed of which she attained or created the magical products that she sold to him, as well as his general distaste for her personality. He seems to have found her very unpleasant. Regardless, I was able to do a decent amount of research using the materials that this particular vendor provided. However, it's not enough. At this point, I'm at a standstill. I can't perform any more experiments or get any closer to providing a product without more materials. The problem being, apparently this particular vendor, as it says in the purchase diary, had a falling out with Mr. Wallendor, and they're no longer on good terms, which spells trouble. I need those materials, Reginald. No materials, no product. No product, no company. You're the businessman in charge of this operation, so I'm gonna need you to handle this. Throw some of that business stuff at it. Numbers and statistics. All that business jargon you do so well. It doesn't really matter how you do it, but you're gonna have to do it. It's either resolve this resource problem, or our dreams of establishing this company and saving our own backsides go right out of the window, Eliza said, crossing her arms with a displeased scowl on her face. This is definitely bad. I don't know what to expect from this person that Alan Wallendor was dealing with. I don't even know if they can be negotiated with. Add on to the fact that Alan Wallendor already had poor transactions with them, but I needed their resources, and apparently they were the only ones that were actually worth it to begin with. There's no other choice, I sighed. It might be a dangerous proposition, but I'm gonna go have to cut a new deal with this vendor. Regardless of anything else, this has to go my way.